Hi, I'm Pete Wharmby. I'm an autistic author and speaker, and tutor and teacher. And I'm going to talk today about the basics of what autism is, how it works, and how it affects people, just so that you've got a decent kind of basic level understanding of the condition. Okay, so I'm going to start by making it really clear that autism is a kind of natural, or it seems to be a very natural variation in human experience. Some people call it a disorder, some people call it a condition. That's fine, but for me personally, I call it just a part of the variety. It's part of the natural diversity of the world. And that's where the term neurodiversity comes from, a new term which tends to be used to cover the whole kind of range of neurodivergent topics such as autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and so on and so forth. So we try to avoid referring to autism as things like a disease or an illness, because it's just not technically correct to do so. You don't catch autism, you don't develop it later in life, and of course, you don't lose it either. You don't, for example, get cured. And even the idea of treatment is a fairly tricky one, because all we can really do is learn to handle our autistic traits better over time. It is, however, I think it's fair to say, a disability. I certainly class it as such, as do most of the autistic people that I know. And that's because of the many reasons that I'll look at a little bit later in the talk. Because there are a lot of aspects of being autistic that can make life quite tricky. In this world of ours, the world isn't particularly well set up for autistic individuals, which means that every day we will experience issues and problems and tricky moments that can be quite disabling. And that's not to mention things like the sensory sensitivity, which can be tremendously disabling at times. But I'll mention more about that later on. Now, the number of people in the world that are autistic is a matter of massive debate. All I can do is give you rough ballpark figures. It always used to be seen as being 1 in 100. I think that is the number still used by the National Autistic Society. But recently, it's become very clear that the numbers may be much, much greater than that. Maybe as high as 1 in 20 or 1 in 30. Some people suggest even higher than that. But it's all in flux at the moment. I'm sure we'll have a better idea in a few years. The fact of the matter is, though, that means that there are a lot more of us out there than you might expect. It means, for example, that every classroom on average is likely to have at least one autistic student. And it means that in your workplace or wherever you happen to be, you probably know an autistic person, even if they don't know that they are themselves. Because, of course, many of us, as I was until the age of 34, are undiagnosed, especially women and especially people from ethnic minorities. So it's worth bearing in mind that there are going to be people around you who may be autistic without knowing it themselves. It actually occurs very, very regularly with other conditions. One of the most common and most obvious ones, I suppose, would be ADHD. That is something that a lot of autistic people have to deal with in life as well. I, for example, am both autistic and I think ADHD. I'm currently on the waiting list to be tested. And that brings up a whole lot of other interesting conflicts and tricky moments as well. So that's something that's very important to remember. Other co-occurrences could be anxiety disorders, eating disorders quite frequently. Also, depression is quite prevalent amongst autistic people, both children and adults. And that brings us on to another really important point, and that is that autism is not, as is very commonly assumed by people who aren't particularly involved in the world of autistic people, it is not a childhood condition. Very often I'll meet people who seem to think it's a little bit like head lice or measles or something like that, something that children have to contend with. It's not, of course. It's something that you are born with. Yes, you're born with it and you exist in your childhood as autistic, but it doesn't vanish at the age of 18. It continues. So therefore, we have a world here. The UK, for example, this country has many hundreds of thousands of autistic people who are over the age of 40, over the age of 50, 60, and so on. And many of those individuals, the older ones, won't be diagnosed until quite late in life. So, for example, I have somebody I know vaguely from social media who was diagnosed in their late 70s. Which, when you think about it, it's going to be quite an interesting experience to look back at such a long life with this vital new information. So we have to remember that the autistic people we deal with are going to be adults as well as children. Children get the focus put upon them, of course, which is reasonable to some extent because children need a lot of assistance and so on and so forth, especially in education. But we can't forget the adults in the situation. Likewise, when we're talking about demographics, it's not limited to boys and men. That's another one of these very old stereotypes that still seems to exist in some places. Autistic women are increasingly finding out that they're autistic. It used to be thought that the ratio was very heavily skewed towards male people, that the majority of autistic people were men. At the moment, a bit like the number of autistic people, it's a bit in flux and we're in a kind of time of discovery, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the ratio may not be quite as severely skewed towards men as we thought. It may well be that the ratio is, balancing up a little bit. We don't know for sure, but basically the idea that there are a lot fewer autistic women is starting to look quite dated and old-fashioned. When it comes to demographics too, we have to also remember that autism is something that will be found in every single demographic across the globe. Okay, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, where you're from, it's going to be there. I always remember finding out that the Polynesian islands in the Pacific have a word in their vocabulary for autism, which is translated as being in your own world, which I think is particularly it's quite an attractive term for it. I quite like it. I'd quite like to make that the word that we use, but I can't pronounce it. But it's a really good reminder that it's not a Western thing. It's not an English-speaking country thing. It's a global thing. It's a human thing. It exists everywhere. Okay, so that means that if you're working with people from different ethnicities and nationalities, then the likelihood of them being autistic is just as great as it is with the, white British community. Okay, so all of that really serves just to remind us how big a deal autism is, in my opinion. It's very easy, I think, for people to push it to one side and just assume we're talking, a real minority of individuals. But it's, as I've said, it's not the case. We're talking about a large proportion of the population. And because of the way the world's set up, we're talking about a large proportion who are really struggling, which of course is why charities such as this exist, because, we're not being too dramatic, but we need help. We really do. As a collective, it's a difficult thing to exist in this world as an autistic person. So charities that offer support and mentoring and training and all that kind of thing are incredibly important. But what is autism? It's all very well talking about, how it works in the world, but what actually is it? And it's actually a very difficult question to answer because there's so much variety. There's a very famous phrase which goes something like, if you've met one autistic person, then you've met one autistic person. The idea being that we are all essentially unique in our own autism, if you like. And yeah, it's pretty on the nose. That is pretty accurate in that everyone's autistic experience will be at least slightly different to the other autistic people that they know or have around them. But there are some common areas, some things that most, if not all, autistic people experience. So we are going to zoom in on those commonalities just for a time, but I do want to stress very, very heavily that these are simply commonalities and that massive variety is there. Okay, so I would use this as a real starting point. These 4 things that I'm going to talk about now truly are a kind of base level. And if you're interested in autism and you want to know more about it, then get out there and read up and listen to videos and find out more, because there's much more that I could talk about, but it would take probably 15 or 16 hours to get it all across in a video. And I don't think many people have got the concentration span for that. So we're going to focus on these 4 key areas of commonality. Okay, so we're going to start with communication. Now, most people who are either autistic themselves or who have worked or, dealt with autistic people in their lives will know that when it comes to communication, there's something going on there. There's something that doesn't quite work, especially when autistic people are communicating with non-autistic people. What we tend to find is that there's a very strange phenomenon that almost feels like there's 2 different languages communicating, even if the language is just English across the board. I like to compare it, and forgive the computer analogy, but I like to compare it with different computer systems trying to communicate. I mean, most people, if you've got an iPhone, an Apple iPhone, and you've tried to hook it up to your Windows computer at home, you've probably experienced how much of a nightmare that is, and just how little these two things want to talk to each other. They just don't work. They're just different. They work on a different wavelength, and that's very much like us. We share the same language. Oh, in this country, for example, two English people will be, sharing the language, but it kind of stops there. And there's an awful lot of other things that are going on that make the communication very, very difficult. And what this leads to is a kind of constant sense of miscommunication and misinterpretation, where autistic people and non-autistic people find that they're simply not being understood the way that they expect to be. And it's because of this difference. I personally believe that autistic people and non-autistic people have very different expectations of how communication should work. And that obviously leads to this clash, this conflict that occurs. A lot of people like to point out that it is the autistic person's fault, if you like, when this happens. It's what we call the deficit model, which is where autistic people are kind of doing it wrong. We're doing it wrong compared to the non-autistic population. I challenge that. Personally, I see it as a difference model. We're just doing it differently, okay? And for whatever reason, people don't like that. But yeah, there is this constant kind of sense that among autistic people that we have to make up for that difference. And we have to try to learn how non-autistic people communicate so that we're not seen as different, so that we're not seen as unusual. And that's where a lot of our stresses come in, because it's hard to do that. It's hard to speak a different language, especially if you don't understand it fully. So these communication differences can come across in lots of different ways. For example, it can be simple things like jokes falling flat, and that can work both ways. So, for example, a non-autistic person tells a joke and the autistic person doesn't recognize that it is a joke. They maybe take it seriously or, take offense or get upset. Similarly, an autistic person might tell a joke and it might fall flat for the non-autistic person. You see how it works both ways, okay, because of this difference. But as I said, it can lead to lots of little kind of micro moments in an autistic person's day where you just feel that you're constantly misunderstood. And it can lead to arguments, and it can lead to fights and, huge disagreements and that kind of thing between friends in school, school children, between partners, in a romantic relationship, between parents and children, between bosses and employees. You can imagine just how much this could spiral out of control. Okay. So that's really an important part of autism to bear in mind. Okay, it's a really fundamental aspect. And if you want to look at more into this whole idea of communication, then there is an awful lot of stuff out there. My YouTube channel, for example, has a couple of videos on communication if you want to look at that. And of course, plenty of other people talk about it too. But I want to move on because we've got 4 to cover. The next one is what I call sensory sensitivity. Okay, another huge thing for autistic people, which, as I mentioned earlier, can be something that is significantly disabling. Okay, so the way to think about sensory sensitivity, I always think, especially if you're not autistic and you're trying to get into that mindset, is think of a time where you were really stressed out. And I like to use the example of trying to parallel park. Okay, now what I've discovered in life with dealing with non-autistic people is that when a non-autistic person is trying to parallel park, which is difficult, unless you're great at it, in which case, fantastic, well done. Most of us find it a bit of a challenge. There's a few things that the person will do. They might turn the radio off. Okay. They might tell the other people in the car to shush, maybe quite abruptly. Okay, so that they can concentrate, so they can focus on the very minute little maneuver that is required to get into that tiny parking space in London or somewhere really stressful. Okay, that is what we do, autistic people, all the time. Okay, because what you're doing there is you're removing extra sensory stress from your situation so that you can concentrate on that task. Okay, autistic people are having to do that all of the time. Because to us, The sensory information that we get, the sounds, the sights, the smells, the tastes, the touch, the feel, it's always too much. It's like we're always parallel parking. Okay, it always feels intrusive and extreme. Okay, so for example, bright light feels so much brighter for us, it seems. And it leads to headaches and leads to stress and wanting to cover our eyes and wanting to escape the situation. The same with strong smells, heavy perfumes and aftershaves, or strong cooking smells, or strong, just generally unpleasant smells, like you can associate with bathrooms and things like that. They affect us very, very deeply, often physically, leading to like nausea, like I said, migraines, headaches, that kind of thing, but also emotionally, just making us want to, I don't know, really, cry in some cases, or run away, or occasionally have what we call a meltdown, or a kind of just an overwhelm, okay, where we just can't go anymore, and we just reach a sort of limit and start to really get very upset and anxious indeed. And it's difficult. It's very difficult to live with, because we live in a world which is very noisy. It's very busy, lots of things going on. You think about a kid, an autistic child in a classroom with, posters and images all over the walls, and the chatter and the noise of the classroom, and the strong smell of the air freshener, or the teacher's aftershave, or whatever it might be, or just the smell of they've just done PE and, it's a bit whiffy. It all adds up. It all adds up, and it can lead to all kinds of things. And, it never goes away. And as an autistic adult, I have just as much trouble with it these days as I did when I was a kid. I guess I can just hide it a bit better these days. But I've said all of that about overwhelm and oversensitivity. But there is a problem, because actually, sometimes autistic people are the exact opposite of that, and are actually undersensitive to sensory input, which is very confusing and very to me it's quite annoying, because it's very difficult to get people to get on board with that. It feels like a paradox, doesn't it? It feels almost ridiculous, but I'm afraid it's the way it is. And it's not just differences between different autistic people. It can be a difference for one autistic person, just depending on the time and depending on their stress levels. So for example, an autistic person might be hypersensitive to sound one day, the noise of a car engine idling in the street, driving you to distraction. The next day, they might want to have loud music in their ears, on their headphones, or something like that, because something's changed, mood or stress or something like that. And it's a very difficult balance to get right. And it can make accommodations and adjustments hard, because, of course, it fluctuates so much. But it is important to know, if you're working with an autistic person who one day seems to be really hypersensitive to taste or smell or something, and then the next day they're just not, and they're happily munching away on some really smelly cheese or something, they're not being inconsistent to bug you. They're not making it up. It's actually a feature of autism, that for whatever reason, they can handle it today. They could not handle it yesterday. Okay. Sensory stuff is one of the biggest issues when it comes to accommodations for people in work and for people in school. And it's the one thing that, autistic people very often ask for help with. Can you make it less bright in here? Can you turn that down? Can you wear less perfume, for, et cetera, et cetera. And it's important, in my opinion, that we respect that, because I can promise you the experience of sensory overwhelm, when it's really hammering into our ears and our eyes, and it's, too much, is so unpleasant. It's tremendously unpleasant. I might seem all together and with it now, but if I was in a situation where, I was being bombarded by sound or bad smells, I do not look this composed. I really do struggle. It's very unpleasant. And, I like to feel like if non-autistic people could live in our heads for just a few days, maybe even just a few hours, I think there'd be an awful lot more compassion and empathy for autistic people out there. Okay, right. So the third thing that I want to look at is what we call monotropism. And this is a relatively new term, and it's becoming very popular in the autistic community, especially among autistic adults, who have the power through social media to, change these things and talk about these things. It's what you might also call a kind of hyperfixation or tunnel vision on specific things. It's basically the word that we give to that real focus that autistic people have on certain things that are happening in their lives. Okay, so for example, that autistic ability that many of us have to just absolutely fixate on a task, often for hours, often at the expense of everything else in our lives. I've found myself, writing, and then looking at the clock and realizing that I haven't had a drink or gone to the loo or anything for hours and hours and hours. It's that apparent inability to tire of things that we're really interested in. Okay, and I'm going to say the word again because it is quite new. Monotropism. So obviously mono meaning single, okay, and tropism referring to a kind of focus or attention. Okay, so just single focus. Okay, and this is where quite famous autistic traits such as our special interests come in. People often know about the fact that autistic people have these hobbies or interests or obsessions that run very deep, that are tremendously important to us in a way that makes non-autistic people's hobbies look almost casual in comparison, and amateur. You often find that autistic people become expert in often very niche areas, very specific things, because of this just unending fascination, tireless fascination with a particular topic. And these topics can be very varied. I mean, the stereotypes are very clear. The stereotypes are things to do with maths and science, the Big Bang Theory effect, where apparently all autistic people love astronomy and physics, There are plenty who do, but it goes well beyond that. It's not just trains and video games. There are autistic people who are fascinated by shells or I know somebody who's obsessed with knitting. I've got a very good friend whose current hyperfixation, and it's like really hyper, is the Beatles. It's all they talk. It's all they want to talk about. It's absolutely all encompassing. And it can be physical things too, such as dance or acting or a sport or a movement or going to the gym, that kind of thing. Don't be too limited in your imagination as to what could constitute a special interest. It really is, in my opinion, if you can think of it, there will be an autistic person for whom that is something they are utterly focused on, 90% of the time. And it can be a really good thing. I mean, I've just written a book about how great special interests are and how they help me through my life. However, there are a few downsides. For example, that whole thing about forgetting to go to the loo, forgetting to drink. If you're not careful, self-care can take a bit of a knock when it comes to these things. Anyone who's had a kid, an autistic child, who's been obsessed with a video game, for example, will probably recognize that phenomenon. Have you been to the loo yet today? No, I'm still playing Minecraft or whatever. But also it can really kind of intrude on your day to day. I find myself when I'm just trying to get other things done, even when I'm talking here right now, with just a little part of my brain kind of waving its hands in the air, going, don't forget to think about this, your favorite thing. And you've got to kind of, shush, go away, go back in your box. I'm trying to do something else here, which I think for an adult like myself, I can get a bit of control over that. I'm not too bad at pushing him back in his little box. But I think for autistic children, it is a real challenge, to quieten that need, to indulge or engage in that interest. And I mean, when I was a teacher, I saw that all the time with my autistic students. They would be itching to talk or write or something about whatever their interest was at the time. And often I'd let them because why not? But it can be distracting. It can be challenging. So do bear it in mind. Another thing about hyperfixation, this monotropism, is that we can also be very single-minded when it comes to opinions. Okay, autistic people we can be very opinionated. Everyone can be very opinionated, but autistic people very often have a very strong sense of morality, of right and wrong. This isn't necessarily something that all of us share, it's one of those kind of generalized things, but many do, to the point where I've seen people refer to autistic people as being a bit like Batman. very, very rigid sense of what is okay and what is not. And that can get us into trouble, because we might, for example, in schools, for example, get a bit upset if we feel the teacher's being unfair. Or in work, if we feel that the boss is being unreasonable, we might be the ones that raise our heads above the parapet and say, this isn't fair, this isn't on. It's a very strong sense of what is reasonable and what it isn't, and it's related to this very strong sense of justice that I think many autistic people have. So that's worth bearing in mind too, and I think it links to monotropism because it's all to do with that focus. When I feel that something unjust has happened, whatever it may be, I can't let it drop. It won't go away. I can't push it to the back of my mind. It will be there front and center until I've at least done something to try to rectify the situation, which, as you can imagine, can lead to all kinds of problems. Having arguments that you shouldn't have, that could have been very easily avoided, for example. Okay, so that's monotropism. So to recap, we've got our communication differences. We've got our sensory, either massive oversensitivity or extreme undersensitivity, depending on the day and the mood. And we've got this monotropism, okay, this single-minded focus. The final one that I wanted to mention is probably the most disabling of the lot, if we're talking about disabling in being able to just get through the difficulties of a stressful life, which I suppose is what disability is all about. And that is executive dysfunction. Okay, now, executive function is a neuroscience term to do with part of the brain which is very heavily developed in human beings for obvious reasons, because it's all to do with planning and preparation and organization and making decisions. Okay, it's that part of the brain which is, very human indeed. It's what kind of separates us slightly from, I don't know, chickens or whatever. Okay, it's something that's very, very important to human beings, because it enables us to get through our very complicated lives, especially in adulthood where things get very complex. The problem for autistic people, and also ADHD people too, is that a very common thing for us is that we have executive dysfunction, which is exactly how it sounds. Basically, that part of our brain just doesn't seem to work properly. So, for example, what this might transpire as might be a very poor working memory. Okay, I certainly have this. I've got a very good long-term memory. If I've read something in Wikipedia that interested me 10 years ago, I might even still be able to remember how it looked on the screen. I can remember every single Pokemon that's ever existed, which is very useful, as you can probably imagine. But I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. And if I set out to remember to do something earlier today and I didn't write it down, then that's gone. That's never going to happen. Okay, so it's a real strange situation where you'll notice that for many autistic people, they seem to know so much from their special interests and everything, but when it comes to the here and now and just basic planning and self-care and getting bills paid and remembering your passwords and that kind of thing, it's an absolute nightmare. Okay, and it's difficult as a child, remembering things like to bring in your pound for non-uniform day, remembering to do your homework, remembering to, I don't know, all those little things that you always seem to be expected to remember at school are things that autistic children and ADHD children are very likely to forget and probably get into trouble for. Because we're not doing it maliciously. It just doesn't work. Our ability to organize, plan, prioritize and make decisions is very often impaired. And if you remember at the beginning, I talked about how I don't like the impairment or the deficit language around autism. And generally speaking, I don't. This is the one area where I'm quite comfortable with it, because I really do feel very fundamentally that is the area of autism where there is an impairment, where something just isn't working properly. It's not so much a difference as just a horrible thing that I really, really get, that really stresses me out, because I don't like forgetting things. I don't like getting all muddled up and, finding decision making hard, but I do. So when it comes to, working with autistic people, autistic children, autistic adults, it's very worth remembering all the time that if they're a bit disorganized, struggling to keep on top of things, there's a very, very good reason for that. It's not just a flakiness or whatever. It's part of their being autistic. It's a very, very much a part of that disability. So, help out and, help out with the organization. I've got a few autistic friends who have actually, they've got PAs, personal assistants who work for them like one day a week because they applied for it through the government for the access to work thing. And it just changes their life because all of a sudden they've got that side of things covered. Obviously, we can't all do that, and children definitely can't do that. Imagine a child with a PA. I guess that's what the parents have to do, and what the teachers have to share a bit of that load as well, because it is difficult, and it's matched with this. You imagine if you're always being told off and always being criticised and challenged for forgetting these basic things, it really does damage your self-confidence. It really does. And it means that, the majority of your interactions with people above you in authority, teachers, bosses, those kind of people, they're just always negative. They're just always negative conversations about you forgetting things and, not doing things properly. And that causes huge ripple effects throughout the rest of your life. And I mentioned earlier that autism very often co-occurs with depression. Well, there's one possible reason why that might be. Okay, because a person can only take so much criticism, in the average day. So there we are. They are what I condensed down into the 4 kind of key areas of autism. And as I said at the beginning, there is an awful lot more out there, okay, that you can look into. I mean, I haven't even touched on topics such as PDA and rejection sensitivity disorder and some of the other occurrences that happen. But that's all out there for you to have a look at, in your own time. Just see this as a starting point. So there we go. I hope that was useful. As I said, I'm Pete Wharmby. I'm an autistic author and speaker. I do this kind of thing quite a lot, as you can probably tell. So yeah, I hope that was useful, and thank you very much.